Thank you very much for this very elegant introduction. I hope I will not disappoint you now after so many stimulating ideas about my life and work. I see a lot of friends here, and I'm glad to see them. I will not make the whole list because I'm going to forget somebody, knowing my mental evolution in the last period. So I am glad to greet them all, and I will speak about nothing Indian, about Europe, about the anti-European tradition of Europe. Allow me to begin. It'll take about 38 minutes or something like that, just to be prepared. If I go beyond this time, please make some signs and I will react. Allow me to begin with a personal recollection. In the first half of 1998, I took part in a meeting of the Council of the European Union. At the time, the presidency of the Council was held by the United Kingdom, represented by Foreign Secretary Robin Cook. The other participants were the foreign ministers of EU countries and prospective members. With the exception of Bronislaw Geremek, everybody spoke in English during the meeting. I have to say I didn't remember that my father said what you said, but I remember what Geremek told me when I became a foreign minister, because I rang him up. He was a foreign minister in Poland, and I said, Bronek, why are we doing that? And he said, because in our countries it is still too early to leave politics in the hands of politicians. So Geremek spoke French during the meeting, and to me, Romania's foreign minister at the time, it seemed polite to speak the language of the meeting's chairman, Mr. Cook. But during a break, my French counterpart, Mr. Hubert Védrine, took me aside and said, in a friendly but rather perplexed tone, I thought Romania was a francophone country. Why did you choose to speak in English? So after that brief conversation, at the working lunch that followed, I have to tell you, I hate working lunches, working dinners. I think it's an enormously stupid idea to institutionalize such bad habits. It's neglecting both eating and working. And as a child, as maybe some of you, I was always told never to speak while eating. This is what happens now on international level. So it followed a working lunch, and I decided to deliver that, at that time, my contribution in French. Romania was then endeavoring to become a member of the European Union and wanted to show it was cooperating with all its potential future partners. However, after lunch, Robin Cook approached me. This morning you spoke English. Why did you suddenly switch to French? This was the first bout of perplexity on my country's arduous but fascinating path to European integration. It would seem, so I told myself, that the European Union was not the rosy common home everybody was talking about. It was not a pure, enlightened administration. It was a living creature with its own humors, jealousies, pride, good and bad moods, crises, fevers, and neurosis. Let me add, between brackets, that since Brexit, my perplexity has acquired a new dimension. I wonder, for example, what the Union's new lingua franca will be once Britain has left the playing field. Will we preserve English out of a kind of commemorative melancholy, or will we witness a battle for supremacy between French and German with possible political irritation on the part of the Mediterranean countries? Engaged as we, East Europeans, were in the process of reinserting ourselves into the European community, we were unaware of, or else overlooked, the old and lasting tensions of continental history, its constituent polychrome nature. Europe has a long tradition of self-segregation, of multidimensionality, of debates on national identity that can go as far as conflict. The first failure of our common home was the fracturing of the Roman Empire into a Western and an Eastern segment. Rome broke away from Byzantium, Catholicism from Orthodoxy, Protestantism from Catholicism, the empire from the Papacy, East from West, North from South, the Germanic from the Latin, communism from capitalism, England from the rest of the continent. The specter of division is what Jacques Dewitte admiringly called the European exception. We easily perceive the differences that make up our identity. We are able to, at any time, to distance ourselves from ourselves. We invented both colonialism and anti-colonialism. We invented eurocentrism and the relativization of Europeanism. The world wars of the last century began as intra-European wars. The European West and East were for decades kept apart by a Cold War. An impossible conjugal triangle has constantly inflamed spirits, the German, the Latin, and the Slavic worlds. An increasingly acute irritation is taking hold between the European Union and Europe in the wider sense, between central administration and national sovereignty, between the Euro countries and those who still have their own currencies, between the Schengen countries and those still excluded from the treaty, all seasoned with the noble rhetoric of unity, a common house, and continental solidarity. Where were we to place ourselves, the newcomers, in a landscape that by no means erred in the direction of monotony? In the following, I shall choose three of the front lines that marked and still mark the family portrait of Europe's complicated fabric. First, the North-South division. Second, the East-West division. And third, the Center-Periphery division. First, the North-South division. Don't forget, say the Greeks, that Europe is a Greek word, the same as democracy, economy, politics. I would nonetheless hasten to add that chaos, apocalypse, and catastrophe are also words that come from Greek. At any rate, it is obvious that the South has arguments to consider itself the source of European culture, even if what we today call Europe is the result of an evolutionary course that has always moved northward, from Athens to Rome, from Rome to the Franco-German Empire, and culminating with the Industrial Revolution in England. Modernity is inconceivable without the contribution of the Protestant North. And so the South has the superiority complex of the founding homeland, and at the same time, the inferiority complex of a failure in matters of civilization. But the Anglo-Saxon world also has the complex of the South, which, as Wolf Lepenies says, is the depository of savoir-vivre, to which Northerners can counter only with a drab savoir-faire. The North rediscovers the attraction of the South, Drang nach Süden. Goethe indulges in italienische Reisen. Byron dies in Greece. But the South, on the other hand, does not mean only Greece. Among other things, it also means the prestige of Latinity. In 2013, Libération, you might know that already, of course, published the translation of an article by Giorgio Agamben, which gave rise to intense debate in the West's marketplace of ideas. The title of the article sounds like a manifesto. The Latin Empire should counterattack. Agamben has discovered and decided to make topical once more a text by Alexander Kojève, dating from just after the Second World War. The Russian-born philosopher, who for a time held high office in the French government, warned against the danger of Europe's political evolution represented by a prosperous and Americanized Germany. To prevent this danger, Kojève proposed the establishment of a Latin empire which would bring together the major Catholic countries, France, Italy, and Spain, under the leadership of France, obviously. Giorgio Agamben adopts the idea of this grandiose project, emphasizing the fact that the only viable alliances are those based on kindred lifestyle, religion, and culture. You cannot ask a Greek to live like a Scandinavian. You cannot force an Italian to adopt Swiss ways. Agamben's essay is not lacking in fertile observations, but something sounds disturbing in its development. First of all, it would seem, as a German commentator writing in Der Spiegel put it, paraphrasing Marx's Communist Manifesto, that a ghost is haunting Europe, the ghost of bad Germans. Culture is the natural medium of Catholic Latinity, while Germany has nothing but civilization. This is the opinion of two ideologues whose intellectual careers would have been inconceivable without the influence of German thought. Kojève developed under the influence of Heidegger, and in particular Jaspers, and made a career for himself as a Hegelian in France. Nor is Agamben unfamiliar with Heidegger or Walter Benjamin. On the other hand, if we are moving southward, then we have to go all the way. Let us rediscover the Near East with Syria, the country of St. John Chrysostomos, one of the founding church fathers, or North Africa with the founding theology of St. Augustine. Let us reevaluate, as Wolf Leppenis does in a book published last year, the idea of a Mediterranean Union, which has always been there, particularly in the French imaginary, from Saint-Simon to Nicolas Sarkozy. But Wolf Leppenis himself draws a distinction between legitimate regional consolidation of the Mediterranean space and the arrogant idea of a Latin empire, which to him, quite rightly, seems like an idea from the political storage room. But to return to the subject of newcomers, what about the Poles, the Hungarians, the Baltic countries, the Romanians, Orthodox Latins, and even the Russians and the Greeks in this context? Will we have to choose between the cultural hegemony of Latinity and the civilizational advantages of the Anglo-Saxon empire? This about north-south. Now, the east-west division. Even if we no longer realize it, we still live in the shadow of the old antagonism between Rome and Constantinople, between the reforming West, the source of modernity, on the one hand, and conservative Byzantium, contaminated by the Slavic and the Ottoman world, on the other. We might say that the Great Schism of 1056 was the first failure of European integration. Historians are in agreement that after the 11th century, the West flourished while the East stagnated. In view of each of the two lungs of European Christendom, the expression was used by John Paul II, the image of the other lung deteriorates to the point of antagonism. Byzantine comes to be a label for excess, stagnation, and a series of defects: despotism, excessive centralization, dogmatism, religious intolerance, excessive state bureaucracy, and so on. A Romanian Byzantinologist, Șerban Ashoka, has rightly observed that the difficulties encountered by East and Southeastern European countries in their efforts to integrate into the European community cannot be explained with a reference only to post-communist inertia and trauma, but also by the fact that they are by definition affiliated to a different type of civilization than the West, the decadent civilization of Byzantium. In 1734, Montesquieu drew a distinction between Oriental authoritarianism and the Roman-derived constitutionalism adopted by the West. Also in the 18th century, Edward Gibbon painted an unsparing portrait of the East: corruption, depravity, superstition, indolence. The Byzantium, described in the writings of Procopius of Caesarea, possesses the laxness of vice-ridden femininity, in contrast with the virile vigor of Greco-Roman antiquity. The descendants of Byzantium, in their turn, find motives to condemn the excesses of Western tradition, rationalism, a blend of scholasticism and Cartesianism, materialism, anthropocentrism, atheism, and all that Western modernity and secularization opposes to Eastern tradition. In addition, not without justification, they point to the fact that it was the Byzantines who published the first textbooks of Greek in the West, that the Italian humanists of the 15th century salvaged the Greek sources of European civilization, literature, law, patristic theology, thanks to the Byzantine scholars who had gone into exile in the West after the Ottoman occupation. They also invoke the unfortunate Fourth Crusade of 1204, which barbarously sacked Constantinople, causing what the great Byzantine historian Niketas Choniates called the deepest rift of enmity between the two worlds. But the two segments of Europe were also cracking within their own borders. In the East, in particular, they were on the one hand apologists of synchronization with the West, usually people educated in Western universities, and on the other hand, zealous advocates of Constantinopolitan glory, which survived in what Romanian historian Nicolae Iorga called Byzantium after Byzantium. In Tsarist Russia, this was also the cause of the conflict between the Zapadniki, the pro-Westerners, and the Slavophile traditionalists. In the post-communist countries' difficult period of pre-accession to the European Union, the general perception regarding their inability to meet the acquis communautaire quickly was that they suffered from a deficit of Europeanness, explainable simply by their geographical position in the East. In such circumstances, to Europeanize yourself seemed to mean strictly to Westernize yourself. I would like to take this opportunity to draw attention to a historical geographical condition capable of giving shape to an unconventional portrait of Europeanness when it comes to the countries of East and Southeast of the continent. These countries are, I believe, European precisely because of their problematic position relative to a certain kind of eurocentrism. A Serbian scholarship student at the New Europe College in Bucharest, Andrei Mitic, has formulated in highly expressive terms the specific profile of the region. We are the East of the West and the West of the East. It is a description that includes both Romania and all the states of the Black Sea region and Balkans. Stimulated by the Serbian student's formula, I tried myself to analyze the presupposition of this argument. To be the East of the West and the West of the East might mean the following. To be both. We have both an Eastern component with a broad openness to the Oriental world and a Western component linked namely to the civilization of the old Europe. For many people, this is an argument in favor of our ability to synthesis, in favor of our potential mission to harmonize differences with the positive effect of their cohabitation. This would be the positive interpretation of our historical and geographical synthesis, which culminates in a true mythology of intermediation. but there is also the risk of a mixtum compositum which would leave us, without any distinct image, victims of an incongruence that gives rise to disorder. To be both means, as a matter of fact, to be between. Because we take a little something from both directions, we are, it is said, conciliators by vocation. We form a bridge between two separate shores, allowing them to communicate. We are a turntable between Asia and Europe, just as we are a good balance between North and South. But at the same time, and unfortunately more and more often, it also exposes us to the status of a vague territory, of a space of transit, swept by winds from every direction. The mediator is important, but he is not, properly speaking, an interlocutor. He is always constantly subject to a suspension of any choice. A third version of our equivocal position would be to be neither nor. We are neither Eastern enough nor Western enough. Dumped in a place that is more like a displacement, stalked by opposing temptations, standing indecisively as the crossroads, we are in constant search of our real self, of the best means to elucidate and express our true being. When faced with Eastern excesses, then we are Westerners. When Western rigor is demanded of us, then we pig-headedly take Eastern liberties. We therefore experience a permanent syndrome of non-belonging. We have no place, or rather, we are poorly placed. As Émile Cioran said in a letter to a Romanian friend after the earthquake of 1977, nous sommes mal placés. Our being east of the West and west from the east means also feeling simultaneously a passion for both old and new. Inclining towards the east, we exalt tradition, the ancestral, times immemorial, orthodoxy, but tempted by the West, we seek and idolatrize the new. We aspire to synchronism, adaptation, headlong modernity. The inevitable risk forms without content. Over hasty borrowing, abusive adaptation. And on the other hand, there is intransigent conservatism, immobility, opacity. This also means oscillating between an insufficiently or incompletely assimilated West and a repressed but defining East. Either we pose as Westerners, provoking rebellion on the part of our non-Latin background, of which we are rather embarrassed, or we pose as Orthodox fundamentalists, causing vague bewilderment on the part of our Western partners and creating problems when it comes to European integration. By turns nostalgic, ambitious, virtually senile, virtually juvenile, we proudly adopt straight-legged German trousers, but sentimentally pine for baggy Ottoman shalvars. Is it a good thing? A bad thing? Do we show the symptoms of a still promising youth or those of an incurable block age? Are we at the stage of raw material, full of potential? Are we mere residues of former empires? For on the top of the imprint of what Dmitry Obolensky called the Byzantine Commonwealth, settled then century-long cohabitation with the Ottoman Commonwealth. Not to mention religious solidarity with Russian Orthodoxy, and so on. How Turkish is Southeastern Europe nowadays? That reminds me of a conversation I had about 2 years ago over a glass of wine with my friend Edem Eldem, who teaches history at the Bogazic University in Istanbul. Do you know something? Edem said. The Greeks are Turks too. Only they think they are Italians. Wishing to display a self-critical European spirit, I answered, my dear Edem, maybe the Romanians are probably Turks too. Only they believe they are French. Later, I told my Hungarian friend, Loci Reich, about that conversation. He looked around him as if to make sure if nobody could hear him and said, you know what? The Hungarians are Turks too. But they think they are Hungarians. Now, the center-periphery division. The question of regional position inevitably brings to the fore the debate about a possible hierarchy, both real and symbolic, between the various European countries. The same as in the past, people talk about a Kern-Europa, the hardcore, the powerhouse, the driving force, the vanguard of unification represented by the Franco-German tandem. Economists, philosophers, Jürgen Habermas, for example, and leading politicians have put forward substantial arguments in support of this idea. And it would be ridiculous to dismiss it in the name of local pride and complexes. We know that Descartes wasn't born in Sofia and Hegel wasn't born in Bucharest. We know that in few places in the world, not just in Europe, are there such prosperity, such social stability, and such style. And it is perfectly normal then that so complicated and important a historical process as European integration should have a guiding spirit to match. At any rate, the idea is not new. It had venerable proponents as early as the 30 Years' War, and then in Kant and in Saint-Simon and Thierry and at the beginning of the 19th century. Correlatively, the idea of a two-speed Europe has also arisen, a concept inevitably not to the liking of those who run more slowly, even though the idea was not the result of some central decision, but came about due to the inaptitude of some of the runners themselves. Although realistic in the immediate present, the idea of the hardcore nonetheless has some flaws. The first is of a historical order. The relationship between the center and the periphery has, over the course of time, proven to be highly flexible and therefore inconclusive. Europe's first hardcore was the Mediterranean space. Then, as we already mentioned, it made its way from Athens to Rome before making a long sojourn in Constantinople. For a time, the hardcore was Aachen. In the 17th century, the European vanguard meant Louis XIV, and in the century that followed, it was England with the Industrial Revolution. In 1815, the essential Europe was equivalent to the Holy Alliance, uniting a Catholic Austrian dynasty, a Protestant Prussian dynasty, and a Russian Orthodox dynasty. Italy has had its great moments, the Renaissance, and so too have had Spain and Holland. And it remains to be seen what the hardcore looks like now that European Union enlargement has brought with it 200 million new Europeans, Central, Eastern, and Southeastern. Viewed historically, Europe looks less like a schematic apricot and more like a pomegranate with multiple cores. In absolute terms, as Pascal said, the center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere. There is a Latin Europe, an Anglo-Saxon Europe, a Catholic Europe, a Jewish Europe, a Protestant Europe, an Orthodox Europe, and lately, whether we like it or not, a Muslim Europe. The idea of a European hardcore also has a psychological and strategic disadvantage. The marginals can declare themselves demotivated. They feel they are perceived as a sort of background noise with very precarious prospects for real integration. At best, they are uninvited guests, condescendingly tolerated at the hardcore table. Not to mention that the psychology of the excluded quickly turns to resentment if it does not become comfortable placidity. At the margins, there are always plenty of people who can hardly wait to indulge in the voluptuousness, torpor, irresponsibility of marginality. They can hardly wait for somebody to tell them that they don't have to bother to get involved, that everything is decided elsewhere, somewhere at the top, in the blinding light of the hardcore. Let me add that once the door of derision has been opened, we will be tempted to view the whole of the European continent as a minor province on the world map, a peninsula of Asia, as Paul Valéry said. At the end of this brief collection of divisions, historical and stylistic tensions, and attempts at placing a hysterical emphasis on differences, we might become Eurosceptics, if not downright depressive. But that was not my intention. On the contrary, all the while I have had in mind the benefits of diversity, the seductive vitality of an organism that defies systematization, that rejects the grayness of geometrical homogenization. We all agree that we don't want the same Europe as Adolf Hitler, one of the pioneers of the idea of the European unity. We don't want a Europe of exclusion, regimentation, ethnic and ideological purity, crucified alterities. Such an evolution would rather lead to the thermal, entropic death of our solidarity. We prefer a complicated Europe to a triumphalist mantra incapable, this is where transcendental meditation comes in, incapable of ever bringing itself into discussion. We prefer a Europe of continuous fermentation, a Europe that confronts its own crisis, that defines itself, among other things, also by its capacity to go through, as Leszek Kolakowski observed, through moments of mauvaise conscience. The Europe to which we adhere is the Europe that founded anthropology, the discipline of understanding cultural difference, the Europe that dedicated itself to the study of savage thought, la pensée sauvage, that filled its universities with departments for the study of non-European languages and civilizations. We often forget that the history of modern Europe began with the improbable encounter between a decaying Roman Empire and invading nomadic tribes from Asia. We are the product of that spectacular hybridization, and this perhaps explains our openness to everything that does not predictably frame us within a static identity. It was no accident that Karl Kerényi put forward a significant possible etymology for the word Europe. It can be translated from Old Greek, the one whose eyes are wide open, and by extension, the one who has broad vision. Obviously, we don't want to replace the triumphalism of an eternally peaceful common house with the triumphalism of fertile incoherence, of crisis understood as a way of life, the only genuinely realistic, subtle, profitable way of life. Yes, the European Union has the fragility of all things political, as Ivan Krastev says somewhere. Yes, Jacques Delors was right to be fearful that in our endeavor to construct a community, we might become a kind of UPO, unidentified political object. Yes, we might join Tony Judt in saying Europe is more than a geographical notion, but less than an answer. Yes, even in the late 80s, Hans Magnus Enzensberger had fears about the post-democratic evolution of our, quote, gentle monster from Brussels. As we know, we face severe cracks in democracy, capitalism, globalization. Nationalism is no longer an arrogant vestige of provincial Europe, but a successful electoral weapon, Robert Menasse analyzes that, in the major countries of the continent's center. We are faced with Brexit, Turkey, refugees, terrorism, Crimea, financial crisis, and more. But the solution is neither deconstructive panic nor the rosy demagogy of a luminous future. Beyond its nebulousness, every confrontation has a welcome dimension of re-evaluation, recalibration, relaunch. And ever since it has existed, Europe has been very well trained to survive, to integrate its fractures, to transform its scars into signs of vitality. It was of the advantages, and maybe the charm, of a seminal disorder that Michael Portillo, the British Minister of Defense between 1995 and 1997, was probably thinking when he said, "I am very much in favor of an untidy Europe. I'm hoping that apart from being good for the new democracies, enlargement will create an untidier Europe." If I'm not mistaken, we are close to achieving this goal. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Andrei Plesu, for this reminder that the crisis can be a chance, and not only a chance, but a reminder of the diversity of Europe and the ability to live with difference, and to make a very strong argument for embracing that difference and go about creating a new Europe with it. And with that, let me open the floor to questions. We have about 20 minutes for questions, because of the simple reason that there is food waiting downstairs.
This would be an argument to give up questions, right?
To limit questions.
Okay.
And ask short questions.
Yeah. I have a question. Ulrike Gero is my name. You mentioned Agamben and the article Libération. Why did you think it didn't work? Because it was I think it was a very vigorous attempt, and we saw Hollande trying, we saw this alliance building, and is the only reason you can say that Germany was stronger? I mean, what is your explanation that this 2013 moment didn't work?
First of all, it is a melody that has been often heard in France. La France, l'Europe des nations, one thinks about Latin nations generally, and the strong position of Germany played a role. On the other hand, as I said, it is strange to speak about the Latin Empire by people who are a product of German culture. This is a sort of, false problem in my opinion. And I have to say, because you asked about Agamben, that in the last period, as much as I like him, he is producing things that perplex me. And maybe you have an answer to these last contributions of him, not directly connected to that, but for instance, in an article published some weeks ago, it appeared in France too, he speaks about the imminent end of the world. And his argument is an analysis of Pope Benedict XVI leaving the papal chair. He thinks that he did that because he suddenly discovered that on the chair of his papal position there was a message from the Antichrist, Giorgio Agamben. Is that not an interesting idea?
Probably he's a Turk.
Maybe he's a Turk. Yes, and he believes he's a pope. So the idea was heard, was analyzed. There was a reaction, but I couldn't say it was accepted or it had some significant followings.
Hi.
Yeah.
So I find myself doing something I've never done before, kind of flattering you. Do you know this T.S. Eliot lecture, What is Classic? I'm just trying to say that I'm very happy that I've been here and witnessing this lecture, because it reminds me of the importance of that lecture. That was done on D-Day in '44, and in front of the verge of society. And T.S. Eliot talks about how Europe has collapsed, and morally and culturally, and how it needs a new foundation. And he's trying to look for what is the source of the new foundation, because the alternative would be a very vulgar, very provincial, not classic America, the American New World Order. And he finds, I'm just mentioning this just because it's very much like the Kojev Agamben, that he finds it in Dante, that we have to rebuild Europe on the foundation of the South, of Dante. He also talks about the center and the periphery. He talks about these divisions that you are talking about. I just wanted to ask your opinion about this, and thank you very much for this.
Well, I don't think I can give a clear and total explanation to this problem. I'm wondering what would have T.S. Eliot said, seeing that Britain is separating from Europe. Is Britain on the side of the province, or on the side of the center that considers the continent a little bit provincial?
Americanized, and he would have moved.
Yeah.
From Britain.
Do you think so?
Yes, he was a Catholic British person, basically. I mean, he was in the Church of England, but that's the most Catholic.
Yeah.
Now,
you remember maybe what Thierry de Montbrial said when Britain declared itself out of Europe. He said this was always the case. England was always with one foot on Europe and one foot on the island, and now it is the reverse that is happening. It is Britain will never leave Europe, and Europe will never be able to get to think England as something marginal and so on. I think this is a nice experiment. With my optimism, I think this may be an interesting experiment. Now, about America, this is a long, long story, whether America is nice or not, or the Americanization is something encouraging, useful, necessary, or not. In the circumstances, the question is a little bit hysterical, I must say, and I understand that. I don't know. The funny thing is that America is, as we all know, the result of a planetary emigration. And now it is exactly emigration that is what America doesn't accept any longer. And this is a very complicated psychological situation, to be old and very young at the same time, to be foreigner and autochthonous at the same time. A very special experiment. I don't want to go as far as that and tell you that after the last elections in the United States, I decided to never say that in public, but I never keep my decisions. I have doubts about democracy itself. If democracy in a country like the United States can produce this kind of events, then something is complicated there, and we must have the courage to rethink that. I can't imagine anyhow, that is the end of my answer, Europe without T.S. Eliot.
There was somebody else who was trying to say what Europe is, and this was an American, George Steiner, and he said, what are the distinctions of Europe? First, people are walking. And secondly, basically, they go to the coffee shops, cafes, and then they have names of the street, which are the names of generals, and the basically squares, which are the names of poets. But, and this is my question, he said, part of the identity of Europe was always the sense of finality, that there is something which is never going to be forever. that Europe was always going to think about it as in a moment. I'm asking you because in a certain way, the way you're talking about our part, I mean the Balkans and so on, as east of the West and west of this, to what extent Europe is not discovering itself as the periphery of the center and the center of the periphery? For the first time, we are not the place where basically history is going to happen. For simple demography, in 20 years, 7% of the population of the world are going to be Europeans. You start to see the world which is much bigger. To what extent we don't see Europe which stops to think in universal terms and starts to think in its exceptionalism?
Yes, I thank you for remembering that text by George Steiner. He says, in Europe, the special situation is that there are no distances. Everything is close, as a matter of fact, compared to all other continents and countries. Between the south of China and the north of China, even the linguistic differences are much bigger than between Sicilian and Scandinavian. And the distance is, of course, the same. And I remember, because you mentioned that after the European accession of Romania in 2007, there was an interview in the streets, mostly in Transylvania, but also in other parts of Romania. And very many said, when asked, what is the big deal of getting involved in it? And they all, very many of them answered, we now can simply go over the border and have a coffee. This is a very George Steiner idea. We simply, nothing more pretentious, more monumental. It's just the chance of suddenly feeling free to cross the border and have a coffee and come back. This is an experience that the European integration brought with it. Now, everything has to have a finality. I would add, thinking of the secularism of modern Europe, everything in Europe tends to have a finality without transcendence. And this is a difficult subject. But I think also that thinking about Europe in this exceptionalist way is damaging. And it is also not nice. It is not done. Europe should never have this type of discourse. Me, Tarzan, you, Jane. You know. No, it doesn't sound European indeed. Yeah.
Thank you. I was perplexed when you were talking about the project of Latin revival of Europe from the South in the name of the age-long opposition between civilization and culture, which was perfectly reversed to the standard application of those terms. So precisely this was the very German gesture of applying culture or culture to yourself and applying civilization to this kind of developed but maybe shallow and hollow from inside other, as we know from like Norbert Elias analysis. And I wanted to ask you, in your thinking about the revival of European something, is it culture or civilization with all the baggage of those terms?
The predictable answer is both. Both Germans and both Latins, both culture and civilization. You cannot, this is a very old debate about these two concepts, and it is true that Germany has brought a lot in constructing this dichotomy. There is a book by Wolf Lepenies, I'm quoting him now, about the German specific situation where culture has an exaggerated role in defining politics, much more present in politics than in other countries. And this explains some of the events of German modern history especially. But this idea of deciding what is better is not, I think, an idea that deserves consideration. One cannot choose between being efficient and intelligent. it is better to try to be both, which is impossible, as a matter of fact. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Since we are talking about different cleavages, I would like to bring in something else, another one. And George Steiner book, he said, I'm not quoting precisely, that Europe is bent over the burden of its past. And the burden of its past. And as compared to America, he said that Europe lacks some sort of creative amnesia. So we have to forget and move forward, move on. So my question to you is, what is, against the current crisis of futurity, what is the rational balance between the past, the memories, and the future-orientedness of Europe? Thank you.
This idea of George Steiner I don't have it in my mind. I'm amazed because he's somebody that is full of the past. He's somebody with a huge culture, with a huge background in matters of history, and suddenly this idea of a beneficial amnesty is astonishing to me. Of course, you don't have to be obsessed by the past. You don't have, when Richard Holbrooke had to visit Milosevic about 50 times, I'm afraid, in order to convince him to be good, in the end he said, it doesn't work, because all our dialogues begin 400 years ago. In this sense, it is, of course, very bad to manipulate the past in order to solve very, I would say, mean problems of the contemporaneity. Of course, we can get Indian and say there is no past, there is no future, there is only the present. I am not very much appreciating I like Americans and America, but the Americans that are perplexed when hear about things common for a middle-class intellectual or person in Europe make me melancholic. When they think that, and this is already much, when they think that Varna is in Romania and that Budapest and Bucharest are both in Poland, I am not very happy. Oh yes, true. yeah. But no, I think we need our past, with the note that we should not treat our past as our own merit. This is what's happening in some countries. Let's take Romania, because I know it. When the Romanian football team wins a football match, all Romanians have the feeling that they did the job. And so when Stephen the Great, hundreds of years ago, succeeded in beating the Turks, it was each Romanian thinks that the merits of the former generations are being inherited and are legitimizing. Using the past in order to legitimize, in order to prove oneself, this is childish and dangerous. But behaving as if the past is poisonous, or it is not there, or one should forget it. We know what importance had the Vergangenheitsbewältigung in Germany after the war. But I always add to that the necessity of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Not everything that is past is bad. Yeah. Sorry, you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I just want to be a little bit the devil's advocate and provoke a little bit here, because I think this was really fantastic, but it sort of took me 25 years back, sort of the renaissance of the European idea and what is Europe. But if you look at the sort of the real existing Europe out there, I don't see so much, the burden of the past or Kojève or Dante or T.S. Eliot whatsoever. It's rather cultural amnesia. And that we are, and also we have a huge demographic and sociological changes of Europe now by migration. We have, and people who have no attachment whatsoever to this European history or European ideas. And also inside the European people who have lived here long, I think these European ideas belong something rather to the past. How can we from this, I think social media, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, and these rather large migratory flows. These are and how can we deal with this? And can we recompose or renew Europe out of this? And just as a remark, I think T.S. Eliot, he was an American thinking he was a European, and Johnny Weissmuller was a German-speaking Romanian who then went to become Tarzan, so to say. I think so. There are movements across the Atlantic. So.
I will come back to the idea of Ivan saying that we should not behave as the saviors of everybody and everything and solvers of all the problems. The problem of the refugees is a huge problem now. If you ask me, we cannot do much about it, to be quite realistic. I think that the only collectivity responsible and capable to solve this problem is the Islamic collectivity. They have to deal with it. And it is in their interest to do so, because what's happening with the Islamic terrorism is a huge damage brought to Islam, to the image of Islam. Islam doesn't deserve that. For somebody who looked into the culture, the problem in Islam, I very much appreciated what Navin Kermani said in his speech when he got the Freedom's Prize 2 years ago, I think. He said, the Islamic terrorism is a paradoxical result of secularization. The people do not have any contact any longer with their own background, with their own culture, with their own books, and they don't even read the Quran. And they have changed the religious position into an ideological, political instrument. So without a cooperation of the safe Islamic countries and of an increased respect for their own image, they should try to do something. We can only defend us, and we do that very badly, I must say. When I hear that the police in England had under observation the 2 or 3 terrorists for 5 years, and they knew them, and they were still free to act, this is for me something that is putting rules too far in front of the danger. We cannot solve this problem, I'm afraid. We can do more, as much as possible in order to save our citizens or to protect them, but the solution will not come from us. This is what I think.